mother, wife,
Air Force veteran,
gun rights advocate.
This is Stacy on the Right. Here's your host, Stacy Washington.
Welcome back to Stacy on the Right. It's hour 3. We're so glad to have you with us this evening. 866-95-PATRIOT. 866-95-PATRIOT. Welcoming in Garion Frankel, PhD student in PK-12 Ed Administration at Texas A&M University. Garion, thanks for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me, Stacy.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. So you have written an article for National Review on Hispanics and the left. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, if you look at arguments in favor of affirmative action over the past 10, 20, even 30 years, you notice a specific trend where the left is appropriating Hispanic Americans in order to support affirmative action. There's this idea that without affirmative action programs, that no Hispanic student is ever going to get into Harvard, and that there won't be any Hispanic doctors or lawyers without affirmative action. And as someone who is Hispanic is in a PhD program at a university that hasn't used affirmative action for 20 years, I just find the whole thing kind of insulting.
Well, it is insulting, but why are they trying to use this on Hispanics?
I think there's several reasons involved, and I think the big one is identity politics. There are certain elements of the left that truly believe that entire groups of people can just be lumped together into these identity cliches, and then any sort of political campaigning or public policy or really anything under the sun can just be sort of filed within these affinity groups. And when you're looking at Hispanics specifically, if you know even two things about Hispanics in the United States, you know that that's nonsense, because Cubans who live in Miami are very different from Tejanos, who are very different from recent Mexican immigrants in California, or the latest wave of Hispanic immigrants coming from places like Venezuela and several countries in Central America. They're all very, very different from one another. And because of this identity politics label and framework, clearly all of these groups are supposedly equally disadvantaged and therefore require affirmative action to have any chance of going to an elite college or becoming a professional in an elite industry. And it's a fundamentally false premise, I think, anyway.
So it is, and I agree with you, but I always like to find out, especially since you did the research from this article, exactly what you just shared, which is, is there an understanding among the target group that Hispanics in America are not one target group, just like blacks in America aren't actually just one target group. There's a wide variety of thought within the so-called black community in America, which one of the chief things that I think is so interesting about liberals lumping blacks together, because I'm a black Republican, so that they basically negates the fact that I'm black, right? But the fact is I am black and I am in America. And so I am a part of, this larger quote unquote black community. But I hate that term because it just lumps everybody in together and ignores the fact that there's a significant population now in America of blacks who they're recent immigrants. So they are, African Americans legitimately, like from the continent of Africa, or they're from South Africa, which is a country. They're from Nigeria. They're from all over the globe. They're from Haiti. They do not think in the same way that blacks who are, generationally from America think about any number of issues. They have different rates of home ownership, different rates of business startups. And so I would imagine among the groups that you named off in the Hispanic community, there's a wildly different experience of America for those individuals. I mean, it just has to be really, really different. You can't just say, oh, Hispanics think, oh, Hispanics believe, oh, Hispanics vote, because the group that you're talking about is really, it's at least 7 or 8 different individual groups. And they have to have something different about them because they're coming from different parts of the world and they have different experiences here in this country.
Absolutely. some of these groups hate each other, to be honest. There's wide diversity among Hispanic Americans, not just in terms of their opinions on affirmative action, but in general. And part of the problem is, especially in the affirmative action debate, is that sympathetic left-leaning journalists have highlighted the work of a select few activists who favor affirmative action within the Hispanic community, and then they present these activists in articles as if they are the clear representative of all Hispanics in the country and that everybody clearly agrees with them. And how could somebody possibly think otherwise unless they're racist or evil or something? When in truth, Hispanics are very, very divided on affirmative action. And in more recent polls, there's some indication that a majority of Hispanics in America, regardless of which of these very diverse groups they come from, actually oppose affirmative action. But for people who just blandly read the news, they'd never know any of this because the journalists aren't highlighting that. They're highlighting the activists. And it's creating a real problem because a lot of Americans don't really understand what other Americans are thinking.
Or I'll go a little further. I don't want to be incendiary here, but truth telling is a full-time job. Gary, and I don't think they want to know about the diversity within Hispanic Americans' experience or Black Americans' experience. I think there's a general desire to gloss over and paint with a broad brush huge groups of people numbering in the tens of millions who would prefer to be treated as individuals, yet get stuck with this. It's a paradigm. Oh, well, Hispanics, of course they support affirmative action. All Hispanics support affirmative. That's like saying all women like high heels or all women like dark denim blue jeans. Come on. There's as much diversity in the thought of women as there is minutes in a day. So why wouldn't there be diversity within a huge population group like Hispanic Americans, which are coming from all over the globe?
Exactly. But the problem is that the reality of these diverse ideas, these diverse backgrounds, these diverse perspectives contradict the idea that there's this overarching identitarian narrative on the left and that it's the responsibility of the journalists to highlight and cultivate this narrative in order to affect a particular policy change that they really want. So ironically, even as you hear a lot of figures on the left preach diversity, they're really ignoring the true diversity, not in terms of ethnicity, but also in thought. Because a young Hispanic person who goes to, UC Berkeley is going to have a very different perspective than a Dominican in New York or a Tejano like myself. And you don't really see this variance unless you go out hunting for it. And, I take a slightly more optimistic view of the general public, and I think people deserve to have all of the facts available to them, but a lot of areas in the media just aren't conducive to that right now.
And without that, there's no real truth to the conversation. I don't really think the conversation makes sense if we're using that old, last century paradigm that all people of a certain skin color or ethnicity or, that they all think the same.
Yeah, for sure. But, anything that sort of goes against the grain or goes against the ideological narrative that they're trying to cultivate, it presents a real problem because when people see that there's a large segment of the population that is not abiding by this narrative in any sense of the world, then they begin to question the media sources and the information that those media sources have been feeding them, and that doesn't really lead to media companies making money. So it's all part of this really, really vicious cycle.
So I think, yes, it's a vicious cycle, but I also believe wholeheartedly in the pushback. So what's happening within different constituency groups within Hispanic Americans where they're hearing that, Democrats believe that all Hispanics support affirmative action? Is there a blowback? Is there a backlash? What's happening?
Well, in this area, I can speak most specifically to Texas because that's probably, I mean, it's my home. It's where my ear is closest to the ground. And you can see that there's been a really positive response to the Supreme Court decision because here in Texas, at most of our big universities, we haven't had affirmative action for a decade, and it's going just fine. Texas A&M, my own university, has recently become a Hispanic-serving institution, meaning that at least 25% of its student body is indeed Hispanic, which, you know, is a big accomplishment in a state where there has been ethnic tension in the past. But this is all coming from organic, more conservative sources rather than any concerted affirmative action type of effort on the part of the left. In Texas, we have something different called the top 10% rule, where if you attend a public school in Texas and you finish in the top 10% of your graduating class, you can attend any public university. You have automatic admission to any public university in the state. For the University of Texas, where it's the top 6 or 7%, they got a special waiver. I forget the exact number. But the point is that admission is based on merit reasons, or it helps people of a particular class of income who may need a bit of financial support in order to attend college. It doesn't just lump people together in terms of race. It's a much better approach, and I think it's proved more popular on, you know, normal Americans, normal Hispanics living in Texas. And I think that other states are going to begin to replicate the Texas model because, according to the Supreme Court, they can't use affirmative action anymore.
Wow. Okay. So first off, 25% of Texas A&M is Hispanic. Is that what you
Correct.
just said? Wow. And then when you say top 10%, so that does not take into consideration any ethnic background. You're in the top 10% numerically, meaning your grades, and you're automatically admitted. You get to pick which Texas state school you would go to. Of course, you still have to apply, for private schools, but for public schools, which are some really big ones in Texas, you're in.
Exactly.
Then what happens if let's say you're in the top, you're in the top 20%, but you still have to apply? Then it's on space availability at that point?
When it gets to that point, every university has a slightly different approach based on who they want to admit or what their capacity levels are, like you said. When I was first applying to Texas A&M for my undergrad degree many moons ago now, they had a policy where if you were in the top 25% of your graduating class and had a certain SAT or ACT score, then you were also automatically admitted to the university. And that's how I got in. I barely got the SAT score by 10 points. But they've had to revise that a little bit because of new capacity restrictions. But there are still ample opportunities for anybody who wishes to attend college in Texas.
So we've had other guests on who've talked about the affirmative action ruling, and they've discussed how most of the Big Ten schools moved away from the straight affirmative action type of a criteria years ago. And so the ruling doesn't really change things for a lot of schools. They've already found other ways to balance their student populations without making race the quantifying factor. So this is really a testimony to, number one, the creativity and problem-solving skills of Americans, and number two, that it's 2023 and we're in a new century and we need to leave the vestiges of the old century behind, the ones that didn't serve us well, the ones that harken back to a darker time. And affirmative action was a remedy that was created to repair things that they felt were still left over from slavery. But we've moved past that now, and that's why the ruling was struck down.
I completely agree. Affirmative action as a policy was a product of its time. You can make a very, very strong argument that it was necessary in the context of its time, but you're rarely going to have a policy that's right or fair or effective for more than 40 or 50 years. That's just not really how public policy works. Things change too rapidly. You need reforms. You need innovation. And I am excited to see what innovations and what reforms stem from this Supreme Court ruling, because all reliable affirmative action simply isn't an option anymore. And in my opinion, nor should it be.
I'm so glad that that we're at this place. And I know that there's a lot of people screaming and whining about it. What's your response to them? Have you encountered some of the people who are very, very upset by this? They're triggered. They're losing their minds over this ruling. And if you have encountered them, what do you say to people who seem they're saying things like, well, blacks will never go to college now that we don't have affirmative action, which that's so insulting. I don't even know how they can let it come out of their mouth without cringing. But that's some things we've seen. Like we've heard from people who believe that.
It has been seen, and it's extremely insulting. There was an article in Bloomberg, which was one of the things that really inspired me to write this piece to begin with, that made word for word the claim that you just stated for their part, that because of the affirmative action ruling, that there will be no more black or Hispanic doctors or lawyers. And that's just ridiculous. It assumes that America's minority groups are part of this underclass that will never have access to any opportunities. And it's true that there are certain levels and that they may struggle to obtain certain opportunities, and there should be policy responses to enable any disadvantaged person to access the education or the type of job that they want. But anybody of any race can be a disadvantaged person. And I think that we've gone so race crazy and so immersed in identity politics that we've forgotten some of the realities on the ground. So what I would say to those people is get out of your coastal bubbles a little bit, talk to people on the ground, see what they're really thinking. Don't rely on activists as the middleman to communicate the message for you. Go on the ground, see how people are feeling, and make policy changes accordingly.
Yep. Because there's a way to get any result you like. And wouldn't we rather that way did not include racial stereotypes or it's racism. It's actual racism because it takes people and it pits them against each other based on race instead of people competing on the capabilities. And then if there's a concern that certain groups can't access certain things, the key is to go back to that educational system. So K through 12, what can we do to prepare more students for a rigorous academic experience in college, and then start doing those things?
Exactly. And I hope I'm going to choose to be naively optimistic, but I hope that there will be at least a few people and organizations who were historically in favor of affirmative action policies that realize and understand the new realities on the ground and make those changes accordingly, because it's really important for every student in America to have the opportunity to attend college or join the workforce or do whatever it is they want to do in order to be a successful citizen and a successful American.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You've been amazing. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on Stacy on the Right. And I know that it's tough. You're actually working on your PhD there, and I think it's going to be fantastic to have you out in the educational sphere speaking truth and adding your voice to the conversation. You're a contributor to Young Voices, PhD student at Texas A&M. Garion Frankel, thank you for your time tonight, sir.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Have a wonderful evening. Okay. You know what we'll do here is we'll take a brief moment, and when we get back, we'll have more Stacy on the Right. Stay right there.